And hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another AP World History Modern AMSCO reading, where today we're reading Chapter 4.3, Columbian Exchange. Meanwhile, I hope you all exchange your views on this video, and sit back, relax, and enjoy another AP World History Modern reading. Anyways, without further ado, let's begin. Quote, "We are crushed to the ground, we lie in ruins. There's nothing but grief and suffering in Mexico, Ensalada Loco, where once we saw beauty and valor." End quote. From Flowers and Songs of Sorrow, anonymous Aztec poet, 1521 to 1540. Essential question: what were the causes of the Columbian Exchange and its effects on the Eastern and Western hemispheres? As the excerpt from the poem above suggests, initial contact and the subsequent conquest and colonization of the Americas proved disastrous for the native peoples. Overpowered by superior weapons and decimated by disease, many native populations declined, dissipated, or were forced to submit to new rulers and a new religion. Although European conquest seriously damaged entire native societies and their way of life, eventually new ways of life developed out of the interaction of three broad traditions of culture: Indigenous American, European, and African. In the process, the Eastern and Western hemispheres became linked in a new way, sharing disease, foods, and animals. For the role Christopher Columbus played in establishing the link, these interactions became known as the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange had far-reaching effects beyond dramatic changes in population and biodiversity. It also contributed to a changing global economy, sometimes with unintended consequences. For example, Spain successfully mined silver in the Americas. However, this silver sparked inflation in Spain, which contributed to the downfall of the Spanish Empire. Diseases and population catastrophe. Until the arrival of Columbus, the peoples of the Western and Eastern hemispheres had been almost completely isolated from each other. For that reason, the indigenous peoples of the Americas had no exposure, and therefore no immunity to the germs and diseases brought by Europeans. Although European horses, gunpowder, and metal weapons helped conquer indigenous Americans, disease was responsible for the majority of deaths. Spanish soldiers called conquistadors such as Francisco Pizarro and Hernan Cortez brought smallpox with them. Smallpox pathogens are spread through their respiratory system. When Europeans, who were largely immune after millennia of exposure in Afro-Eurasia, had face-to-face contact with indigenous populations, they infected these populations with the deadly disease. As colonists began to settle in the Americas, so did insects, rats, and other disease-carrying animals. Measles, influenza, and malaria, in addition to smallpox, also killed many native peoples of the Americas. The indigenous population of the Americas fell by more than 50% through disease alone in less than a century. Some American lands lost up to 90% of their original populations. It was one of the greatest population disasters in human history. Underneath the passage I just read on page 210, we can see an image shown here, which is sourced from Wikimedia Commons, with the caption, "Deadly diseases such as smallpox that came from Europe spread rapidly in the Americas," with an image of people showing symptoms of smallpox and appear to be lying in bed or dead with lots of bumps on them. Animals and foods. Germ and disease transmissions were only part of the Columbian Exchange. Another major component of the exchange was the sharing of new crops and livestock in both directions. Before the exchange began around 1500, Mesoamerican peoples consumed very little meat. Although contemporary Mexican food sold in the United States is reliant on pork, beef, and cheese, the indigenous people of Mexico knew nothing of pigs or cows until Europeans introduced them. These animals, along with Mediterranean foods such as wheat and grapes, were introduced to the Western Hemisphere and eventually became staples of the American diet. After domesticated animals, the animal the Europeans brought to the Americas was the horse, transformed the culture of the American Indians living in the Plains region. With the arrival of the horse, Indians could hunt buffalo on horseback so efficiently and over a larger region that they had a surplus of food. That efficiency gave them more time for other pursuits, such as art and spirituality. However, competition and even armed conflict among tribes increased. with those having the most horses having the most power. At the same time, European explorers took back Mesoamerican maize, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, peppers, and cacao to their home countries, where people started to grow them. Potatoes became so popular in Europe that they are often thought of as being native to certain regions, such as Ireland. The introduction of these vegetable crops caused tremendous population growth in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Cash crops and forced labor. People themselves also became part of the exchange. The coerced arrival of enslaved Africans to the Americas brought biological and demographic changes. For example, Africans brought okra and rice with them to the Americas. Tobacco and cocoa, produced on American plantations with forced labor, were sold to consumers in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Even though slave traders kidnapped millions of Africans from their homelands, populations actually grew in Africa during the 16th and 17th centuries. That population growth happened because of the nutritious foods that were introduced to the continent. Yams and manioc, for example, were brought to Africa from Brazil. The lure of sugar. While Spain and Spanish America profited from silver, the Portuguese Empire focused its endeavors on agriculture. Brazil, the center of the Portuguese American Empire, with its tropical climate and vast tracts of land, was perfect for sugar cane cultivation. As disease had decimated the indigenous populations, however, there were not enough laborers available to do the cultivation. Moreover, many of the people who were forced to labor in the sugar fields escaped into the uncharted Brazilian jungle. In response, the Portuguese began to import enslaved people from Africa, especially from the Congo Kingdom and cities on the Swahili coast. Slavery. Sugar's profitability in Europe markets dramatically increased the number of Africans captured and sold through the transatlantic slave trade. Sugar cultivation in Brazil demanded the constant importation of African labor. African laborers were so numerous in Brazil that their descendants became the majority population of the region. Slave importers sent more than 90% of slaves to the Caribbean in South America. Only about 6% of slaves went to British North America. Until the mid-1800s, more Africans than Europeans went to the Americas. Slaves often died from backbreaking working conditions, poor nutrition, lack of adequate shelter, and tropical heat, and the diseases that accompanied such heat. Sugar plantations processed so much sugar that they were referred to as engenhos, which means engines in Portuguese. Because of the engenhos' horrible working conditions, plantation owners lost from 5 to 10% of their labor force per year. Slavery is discussed in more detail in the topic 4.4, which is another video on this channel and playlist. Growing cash crops. The Spanish noticed Portugal's success with plantation agriculture and returned to the Caribbean to pursue cash crop cultivation, such as sugar and tobacco. Cash crops are known for sale rather than subsistence. Soon, sugar eclipsed silver as the main moneymaker for the European empires. African presence in the Americas. African cultures were not completely lost once captives arrived in the Americas. In fact, during the African diaspora, dispersion of Africans out of Africa, enslaved Africans retained some aspects of their cultures. Languages. With a few exceptions, Africans were not able to transplant their languages to the Americas. The captives were forced away from their communities, and they soon found themselves on ships among captives from all across West Africa, and on some slave trips from across East Africa as well. Since captives were taken from myriad African cultural groups, most did not share a common language. Understandably, they found it difficult, if not impossible, to communicate en route. Because of their linguistic isolation on the ships in the Americas, most Africans lost their languages after a generation. In spite of this forced isolation from their cultures, West Africans managed to combine European colonizers' languages, English, Spanish, French, or Portuguese for example, with parts of their West African language and grammatical patterns to create new languages known broadly as Creole. Because the Caribbean islands had a larger concentration of enslaved Africans than did North America, Creole languages dominated there even today. In the United States, which had a smaller percentage of Africans in comparison to the total population. Few examples of Creole languages exist. One notable exception is the Gula or Geechee language of coastal South Carolina and Georgia, in places where slaves once composed 75% of the population. Music. Africans brought their music with them. The syncopated rhythms and percussion they used influenced later styles. These include gospel, blues, jazz, rock and roll, hip-hop, rap, samba, reggae, and country music. One reason many African descendants maintained their musical traditions was because enslaved Africans in America used them as a means of survival, singing tunes from home to help them endure long workdays as well as to communicate with other slaves, such as when planning an escape. They blended European Christian music with their own religious songs, known today as, I'm not allowed to say this word due to the fact that otherwise I'm going to be completely and utterly banned from YouTube and cancelled on Twitter, blank spirituals. Essential elements of American folklore music history, enslaved people also invented the banjo, which is very similar to stringed instruments found in West Africa. Food. In addition to rice and okra, Africans brought their knowledge of how to prepare these foods. The dish known as gumbo, popular in the southern United States, has roots in African cooking. With influences on language, music, food, and much more, African culture has had a profound and lasting impact on life in the Americas. Columbian exchange, Eastern Hemisphere to Western Hemisphere, is the chart we are now going to start reading from. If you'd like to skip ahead, you may a little bit, though there's not much left. Type of exchange, crops. Examples: sugar, wheat, barley, okra, rice, oranges, grapes, lettuce, coffee. Effects on the Western Hemisphere: deforestation to make way for sugar, wheat, barley, okra, rice, and other crops. Soil depletion from growing the same crops repeatedly on the same land. Type of exchange, animals. Examples: horses, oxen, pigs, cattle, sheep, goats, mosquitoes, rats, chickens. Effects on Western Hemisphere, overgrazing by cattle, sheep, and goats. Soil erosion because of overgrazing. Spread of diseases from mosquitoes, rats, and livestock. Okay, type of exchange, people. Examples: Europeans, Africans. Effects on the Western Hemisphere: racial diversity, chattel slavery, social structures based on race and ethnicity. Type of exchange, diseases. Examples: smallpox, measles, typhus, bubonic plague, influenza. Effects on the Western Hemisphere: spread of disease, millions of deaths among Native American populations. Type of exchange, technology, and ideas. Examples: alphabetic writing and firearms. Effects on the Western Hemisphere: improved communication, new methods for hunting and warfare. Alright, now to the next chart. Columbian exchange, Western Hemisphere to Eastern Hemisphere is the chart we'll now be reading from as well. Type of exchange, crops. Potatoes, maize, manioc, tobacco, cacao, and peanuts are examples. Effects on the Eastern Hemisphere: better nutrition, increase in population, and greater wealth. Type of exchange, animals. Examples: turkeys, llamas, alpacas, and then guinea pigs. Effects on the Eastern Hemisphere: more diverse diet, new types of textiles. Type of exchange, diseases. Examples: syphilis. Effects on the Eastern Hemisphere: increased health risks. Type of exchange, people. Examples: Native Americans. Effects on the Eastern Hemisphere: ethnic diversity. Type of exchange, technological and ideas. Examples: rubber and quinine. Effects on Eastern Hemisphere: rubber was first used as an eraser. Quinine provided a treatment for malaria. Environmental and demographic impact. Contact between Afro-Eurasia and the Americas brought dramatic changes to both. Most changes resulted from the Columbian exchange. In addition, though, Europeans used agricultural land more intensely than did American Indians. For example, colonists cut down trees to clear areas for planting crops, and they created large fields that they cultivated year after year. As a result, deforestation and soil depletion became problems in the Americas. In addition, Europeans often lived in more densely populated communities than did American Indians. This increased the strain on water resources and created more concentrated areas of population or pollution. Key terms by theme: environment disease, smallpox, environment animals, horse, government empire, conquistadors, environment foods, maize, cacao, okra, rice, and sugarcane. Culture African, Creole, gumbo. Economy exchanges, Columbian exchange, transatlantic slave trade, Engenhos, cash crop. Society population, African diaspora. And ladies and gentlemen, that's going to do it for the reading portion, and now onto the My Thoughts section. So one big thing I'm definitely going to say here is it's definitely safe to say that there was a lot to take away. Like for starters, look at the chart on page 213. This is probably the most influential, if not important, chart you're going to see. So, on this chart, you're going to see a lot of items which are pretty important and basically do share a lot of what happened, what did people bring, what may have caused other things to happen. And again, this chart is going to be very important for you to keep in mind if you're thinking about later in history. Because when looking later, you can realize that some of these animals, some of these crops or items or diseases were not actually native to that area. And so, because of this, yes, it can be noted that because of this, there were some things that were caused by these. Like, for example, there was a massive amount of farming, and then in the eventual future, the Green Revolution, sparked by the use of certain animals in that area, and also crops that were immensely planted for the sake of having cash crops. You'll see all of that in a later chapter, in a later video, in a later playlist on this channel. But anyways, aside from that chart on page 213 being the most important and influential thing you'll need to take away from all this, another thing that I thought was interesting was certainly the African presence in the Americas chapter, or a portion of the chapter, explaining how there's an African diaspora, including the dispersion and, if anything, slight assimilation of the language, the music, as well as some of the food as well that went into the culture, because honestly, looking at it, we can definitely see that there are some actual influences that we can see even up to today, where we can still see some of these music and some of these influences in music and even languages such as Creole, which is still spoken to this day by some people. Meanwhile, also with the food as well, it is interesting to know, again, how African people actually brought some of their cooking techniques as well. Because also, a major theme and continuity across all of history is guaranteed this, is that whenever one person from, okay, let's say there's a person from Group A. Now, this person in Group A is on one side of the world. Now, then there's an entire society in Group B, which is on the other side of the world, which has never dealt with anyone from person A's group ever. They've never seen or heard of or anything from this person or this group or society. Now, Group A, let's say they migrate or they move all the way to Society B for some reason, and because of that, they bring with them all their knowledge of what they have and their culture as well, and then offers it to Society B, which, because that, which is a cultural diffusion of what will happen later, because some of those people will think, huh, that's interesting, let's adopt some of these things that this person does, or let's adopt some of these habits, or person A will actually bring something new to the table and try mixing some of what he does or know with what these other people know in Society B. Anyways, that was an odd example, though, to basically kind of just say what a major continuity was, if any of you got what I basically just said as an example. Or if you want me to simplify it, basically, if one person, which is kind of foreign to one group, goes to this other group, they will basically be able to bring with them all of their knowledge of things that the second group has never experienced or dealt with, being able to create new things from things that were already existing. However, that is pretty important, as well as some things that are of note, which is the lure of sugar portion of the chapter, which during that, it can be important to note that sugar cane was very vital when it came to being a cash crop, which even influences later in history, but we'll get to that when we get there in the other chapters. Also, slavery. Now, slavery becomes a big continuity until about the 19th century, because that is when the abolitionist movements truly kick off, because for there we see many abolitionist movements, such as the Haitian Revolution, which is actually a very successful slave uprising in Tahiti, a French colony, but we'll get to that again in a later chapter. Anyways, that concludes my thoughts. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please consider dropping a like down below, and also hit the subscribe button if you really liked the video. You can always unsubscribe if it ever becomes an inconvenience. Also, try to hit the notification bell to stay up to date when I post more content. Anyways, that's going to do it for today, and stay tuned for chapter 4.4 coming up right after this. Anyways, remember, ladies and gentlemen, to stay safe, stay happy, and remember, stay entertained.